Hi, welcome to Up Your Nerd Cred. Did you used to know everything that was happening in the Marvel and DC universes? Did finding out that some superheroes from Marvel and some from DC blow your mind? Has keeping track of everything happening there and then realizing we're only talking about this comics universes, not the cinematic ones, and the different universes with their own multiversal crises have gotten a little bit out of hand? Oh, don't worry. Up Your Nerd Cred is here to talk about the gods cosplaying as men, the men cosplaying as gods, and how much the cinematic universes are really living out. At the end of each episode, you'll hopefully know a little bit more than you did and get up your nerd cred. I'm your casual nerd host, CiCi. The weather in NYC is starting to get into the general vicinity of freezing, and that is feeling like some version of a tropical heat wave. And I am cranky as hell that I'm hyped about temperatures hitting the 30s and 40s, okay? I was born in South Texas. How am I excited about temperatures below my age on the Fahrenheit scale? Like, on one hand, climate change. And on the other, it would be nice to get rid of a bit more of the snow, right? Anyway, my co-host on being here means that I don't get to get sass about the weather. He's in LA, so what? I get ice storms, he gets wildfires. We fight crime? Meh. But I want to make sure, just because we are clarifying the format does not mean that we are going to actually skip out on the format altogether, right? Of course, right. So, podcast listeners, what are we nerding out about this week? Just remember, you can learn out about all kinds of things. It does not just have to be heroes and villains, okay? I keep watching the Benito Bowl because it was the light. Lunar New Year and the Year of the Fire Horse. It's supposed to be really, really interesting. I will say that if Pam Bondi still has a job in 6 months, I will be mad surprised. Mad surprised. What am I nerding out about? Well, my very cool brother was in town, and he asked me if I wanted to see Ragtime. I'd said yes, right? Because I saw Joshua Henry in Into the Woods, and he killed it as one of the princes, okay? Honestly, this is one of my favorite performances of the song Agony. It is a lot, right? Now, I'd also remembered that we'd sung one of the songs from Ragtime when I was like an active choir girly. And, I'd assume that we'd like sung the lead in to the intermission. Podcast listeners, if you've sung Make Them Hear You and you have not had anyone burst into tears during the performance, you have not experienced Ragtime. Make Them Hear You is the 11 o'clock number. All right. When Broadway shows started later in the evening, right, the 11 o'clock number was like the big showstopper right before like the denouement and like, the end of the show, right? Shows would wrap up, and 11 o'clock is basically when you would have this big number. So, yeah. Theater lingo aside, even though the show, like, for me, right, it started, like, kind of slowly, I was crying at, like, so many moments in it. Like, I had heard Brian Stokes Mitchell perform Let Them Hear You before, right? But, like, the show as a whole, it's, like, it's amazing. Okay, it's amazing. I'm pretty sure there's actually a current cast album out there that you can go and stream. Honestly, it's Black History Month, okay? So, like, after you finish, like, the pod episode, go and stream that anyway, right? So, while I get my streams going, I might go watch a quick slime tutorial of the show, and we'll be right back to Up Your Nerd Cred. Welcome back. I'm going to say something that feels braver than it is. I don't like Miss Elena or Katarina Kitty Cat from Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood. Those kids irritate me in ways that I felt really guilty about for like a while. And I actually finally realized why the other day. Miss Elena and Katarina Kitty Cat probably would have been considered an abundance of diversity options in kids' TV shows back in the 90s. And as the one Black kid in a lot of friend groups growing up, my character was often assigned to me by virtue of being Black. Yes, I could just as easily end up living my most Smurfette life if there was like, a couple of girls available. But, am I a Black Ranger or a Pink Ranger? I mean, Kendra the Vampire Slayer had, what, 2 episodes? Personally, I preferred Ginger Spice in my youth, right? But somehow always got stuck as Scary Spice whenever there was a Spice Girls activity that we were doing. And part of why it sucked was honestly that I didn't like Lisa Turtle and Save for the Bell. I hated her. I thought she was kind of a bitch. I don't talk like Dion and Clueless. And I find her to be kind of annoying and convinced that she is like, being profound when she's not. And also, let's be honest, I didn't have Jodie's work ethic on Daria, okay? Like, I might have had, like, some of the criticism stuff that she had, but that girl was actually working on stuff all the time, and it was really hard for me to see myself in her, right? Like, there are characters that I'm supposed to identify with, me, right? Yes, they are other Black girls, but they're not really like me, right? And when there'd be complaints from like people about the lack of Black girls and things, we would get guest stars, right? So like Aisha Tyler was one of the few Black people that Friends deigned to have present in, let me check my notes. New York City, a city that was about 25% Black at the time that they were filming. Are there parts of Manhattan where you might not be able to see as many Black people? Absolutely. I mean, let's be honest, Central Park was built on what had been a very Black part of the island. The silver screen segregation has slowly been breaking down, and it is actually moving towards showing, a better representation of actual diversity. Let's think about what's actually going on here, right? Let's get a little academic about it, shall we? So from the 1970s till now, the percentage of the United States population marking Black on the census has been between about 11 to 12.5% of the demographics, right? Like at the high water mark, you've got about like 1 in every 8 people or so who are marking themselves as Black in the United States. People have really only been able to self-select since the 60s. And the civil rights era tended to have like, Black people as like kind of like the news, rather than like the actors in programming kind of in many ways. So the racial categories before that also were a lot less broad, right? So let's just go ahead and focus our energy basically. Like we're going to start looking at things like in the 1970s, right? I mean, 1970s is there's a lot of stuff that had already happened by that time and a lot of progress that had been made, right? Like even Mr. Rogers and Francois Clemens had shared a football by 1969, right? So, I mean, look, theoretically, de jure segregation has fallen, and regardless of your ethnicity, people were starting to realize that dollars were still great. Now, Black people's visibility on screen was still narrow, but it was increasing. So think about it, like Good Times, Sanford and Son, The Jeffersons. If you wanted to watch Black people on TV in the 70s, there were some absolute bangers, okay? Norman Lear was actually like putting out Black shows and telling Black stories with a mostly white writing staff. Um, a lot of the shows that he produced were low-key groundbreaking, okay? Like this is the same guy who produced All in the Family, where the entire conceit of the show is that like the patriarch's conservative views are constantly like put into question, and he has to reevaluate where he stands on things because he's exposed to like the different perspectives of his family and neighbors on a regular basis, right? It's actually like strikingly progressive for the day. But let's be honest, it's not exactly the bastion of our stories ourselves, right? So yes, Black actors were working, and I'm a big fan of that, right? The characters they played tended to be fairly impoverished and weren't really doing that much for self-improvement. Like Good Times, for example, right? They started off with an intact Black family, which was something that was, kind of unusual for some of the stereotypes at the time. But the show's emphasis on JJ pushed John Amos out. And so we ended up with, once again, another stereotypical Black single mom closing the show. So we do have the Jeffersons, though. They did move on up, right? But some of that was after the Black Panthers. Like there's a meeting that Norman Lear took with several Black Panthers, and he mentioned in his autobiography how the young men he'd met with told him, every time you see a Black man on the tube, he's dirt poor, wears ship clothes, can't afford nothing. Now, this admonition inspired him to have George and Louise move on up to the Upper East Side to that deluxe apartment in the sky. Interestingly, the show was able to racialize the white neighbor in a way that you don't actually typically see on TV. He was married to a Black woman and was surrounded by Black people. Now, let's not get entirely, crazy, okay? He's not quite the only marshmallow in the cocoa, right? He still had plenty of white castmates. But his whiteness was remarked upon and not treated as the default. Also, side note, podcast listeners, Merriam-Webster defines racialization as the act of giving a racial character to someone or something. So, pointing out that he is white is the exact same racialization as pointing out that George Jefferson was Black. The implications of racialization are a whole other thing, but I've already detoured into a whole middle school essay opening paragraph about the Jeffersons when the 70s was also, let's be honest, the era of Blaxploitation, right? Pam Grier, Richard Roundtree, okay? Both of them stayed working, okay? You're not going to tell me that Shaft and coffee are not just like synonymous with Blaxploitation and the 70s, right? But a lot of the films of that time frame, of that genre, were really focused on like the hard scrabble and like deeply urban life where, like, pimping and drug dealing and evading police capture, it's featuring in like a lot of stories, right? Like, in these stories, the protagonists are very specifically working to overcome a system that is designed against them, and the man is actively working towards their detriment, right? Like, you're not going to necessarily choose some of these criminal activities if you have other choices, right? I'm not going to delve too deeply into the respectability politics that the film criticisms that other people had for the genre, right? I will say that the NAACP, the SCLC, and the National Urban League all came together to advocate against like the stereotypes and flattening of an entire racial group into a singular representation, because Blaxploitation tended to do that. It wasn't necessarily showing us as full, diverse people. It was showing us kind of in a very narrow and specific kind of life, one that is really hard for me as a nice suburban Black girl to identify with. Actually, though, what I will say is, as we skip towards the 90s, when I was actually just starting to watch TV and movies, like, around the time that I'm starting to like really start understanding what's going on, there was a bit of a Blaxploitation revival, right? Spike Lee, was really like coming front and forward, and Spike Lee joints were actually featuring many of the elements, right, that we would find in the Blaxploitation genre previously, but he was able to incorporate the criticisms of the past films to allow us to like focus on like urban youth without necessarily making the focus about criminality, right? School Days is focusing on 20-somethings in college. They're talking about colorism and classism, right? All a bunch of Black kids. But, it's really important, and it's kind of a new version of Blaxploitation. Now, I was not old enough to watch this at the time because I was 3. All right, look, I'm not trying to do multi-decade hops all willy-nilly, but, we gotta get to the media landscape that I grew up in for like most of this premise to work. Anyway, to the 90s. So a fun fact, actually. I went to the Wikipedia page to look at the shows actually from the 90s, right? Like they have a lot of disambiguation pages for things. So I wanted to look at the shows from the 90s. And I actually saw that they had like, a disambiguation for 90s Black sitcoms. And I went and looked, and there are 67 shows on that list. Nice. Most of the names of the shows I've seen. There are a number of those shows that I've seen at least one episode, if not multiple of. And It's really interesting too. A lot of the shows that they had in the 90s are broken out into different categories, but it really kind of highlights a little bit as like a minor detour, like the difference between Black famous and white famous. Like it can be incredibly stark, right? Like Robert Townsend, Lorenz Tate, Nia Long, Whitfield, right? These folks have had the Black community in a chokehold for decades, right? That's a whole other discussion. But like, there is a lot of, Black media that did actually exist when I grew up, right? And really, by the time I was watching things in seriousness, there were more things for me to watch, even than like, my mom and, her mom and whoever else had before me, right? So I'm not acting as though I didn't have any kind of Black media when I grew up. There were things for me to watch, but it's worth pointing out that there were only so many things for me to consume that were very specifically like, geared towards me being Black, right? Again, those 67 shows that I mentioned, those 67 Black sitcoms were across the entire decade. And a lot of shows fail before they really get past a few episodes, right? So let's point out the landscape wasn't packed, okay? So, like, generally speaking, if I'm watching something on TV, I'm watching a lot of shows that have an overwhelmingly white cast. Honestly, in the 90s, they had such an era of the overwhelmingly like white cast. They had Lisa Loeb on Mad TV singing the theme song to Pretty White Kids, Pretty White Kids with Problems. It's one of their sketches, right? About pretty white kids with problems because there are so many TV shows that were pretty much that. Did you watch Not Another Teen Movie? Two token Black guys ran into each other at a party, and one of them had to leave, so the balance wasn't messed up. Damn. Shit. That's whack. Anyway, one of the things that we talked about in our season premiere, I used to play with myself, where we talked about a lot of the things that we grew up with London Hurts You. Go watch it if you have not. I can wait. I can wait. Okay, great. You're back. All right. So, but, again, like we talked about, like the media sorting us into different boxes and such, right? Like, let's go back to one of the issues that I mentioned earlier. Do I want to be the Black? He is unambiguously Black, like I am, right? You know that he is like making sure that there's macaroni and cheese at his Thanksgiving dinner. But a boy? No. Oh. Ew. Do I want to be the pink Power Ranger? She is a girl and she does like gymnastics like me, but she is a white girl who can use the hotel shampoo. Side note, I learned early on that if I tried to use the hotel shampoo, it would destroy my hair. I would look like an absolute wreck, and my mom asked me to not do that again. So, yes. Which box do I get to sort myself into, right? What part of myself do I get to leave outside of the box to sort of like attempt to fit into the one they make for me, right? Yeah. But let's bring it back to like the Miss Elena and Katarina kitty cat of it all, right? There is kind of a scarcity mindset that I ended up having back in the day, and honestly, that I'm just now realizing that I can kind of let go because there were so few characters who were put in there for me to identify with, right? It's hard to not feel awkward and vaguely like I'm being like, some kind of like race traitor, or like I'm engaging in misogynoir because I don't like Lisa Turtle, because I'm honestly more interested in Daria's crush on her, best friend's brother than I am on Jodie's solid relationship. You know, like I feel kind of badly about the fact that I think that Chastity is actively a bad friend in 10 Things I Hate About You, right? Kendra is great on Buffy, but Willow's character growth and Allison Hannigan in general really did it for me. Side note, AM has been teasing me about how nerdy redheads have distracted me since I first discovered them as a conceit. So, yeah, neither here nor there. But I can try to figure out, am I more Tia or Tamara? Am I more Dee Dee or Mona on Half and Half? Again, huge difference between Black famous and white famous. That show was great. But like, I can figure out which sister I am on Deliver Us from Eva in a way that doesn't make sense if I'm trying to place myself in the Taming of the Shrew that I typically see, which is interesting since when Gabrielle Union was in 10 Things I Hate About You, which is another adaptation of Taming of the Shrew, I was mostly focused on being annoyed about disliking her character. But in Deliver Us from Eva, being annoyed at her was kind of like the whole conceit of the movie. When there's only like the one token in the cast, complaining about them feels dangerous, right? Like, the showrunners take the criticisms of the character being flat or not true to life or just kind of a bitch and use that as an excuse for why the character should be just like written out to just focus attention on the white characters, right? Orlando Jones had been killing it as a Nazi and was an important part of the entirety of the American Gods TV show until suddenly his character wasn't there anymore. Angela didn't join the Boy Meets World cast until season 5, and her dating Sean, instead of them just trying to insert some random black guy for her to date, that was actually like wild for the time, right? It's actually like on the top of the Boy Meets World cultural impact list on Wikipedia. Angela and Sean were a solid couple, and honestly, like one of the healthiest relationships on the show. Yeah, way healthier than Corey and Topanga. I said it. But she could actually have been set up like easily to be pushed to the side, right? Think about Mercedes on Glee. Anyone who thinks that she is not Rachel Berry's equal, if not better, is lying to themselves. Who is she paired with, right? For most of the series, other black dudes who are really like given pretty short shrift in their characterization, right? Like who she is in a relationship isn't actually explored in depth until she and Sam date, right? Yeah, her Christian faith has been explored generally in other episodes, right? But it's not until she and Sam have been in a relationship for quite some time before we discover that her faith means that she chooses abstinence in her relationships. The other members of New Direction's sexual activity has guided a number of parts of the show, but hers don't seem to have an impact until it's unlikely to do with any of the major parts of the storyline. I will say, though, that it's really nice. Black stories have grown, right? And they're not really confined to a block on UPN anymore. Not just because UPN doesn't exist anymore, right? But there is a way that we've been able to step up and tell our own stories without having to rely on stereotypes. That's really starting to open up a whole new world for like all of the young black girls coming up now. I'm really excited about this. So I'm going to take a quick break to squeal about how representation has improved since I was a kid, and we'll be back for our thrilling conclusion. Welcome back to our thrilling conclusion. I want to focus our attention for a bit on the word intersectionality, as defined by Kimberlé Crenshaw in, 1989. Nearly 40 years later, the definition holds up. I'm pulling this from the UN Women's site. Professor Crenshaw defines intersectionality as a prism for seeing the way which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. All inequality is not created equal, she says. We tend to talk about race inequality as separate from inequality based on gender, class, sexuality, or immigrant status. What's often missing is how some of the people are subject to all of these, and the experience is just not the sum of its parts. In the legal framework, intersectionality was developed to deal with, all right, you have to think of it like this, how a Black woman has to respond to a company with Black men and white women in positions of leadership and authority. They feel the racial diversity box is checked by the Black man, and their gender diversity box is checked by the white woman. So the Black woman who is struggling to gain recognition for her work is asked to find representation in people who only share one marginalization point, and kind of finds herself stuck in a place where she has to define herself as being either Black or a woman. Which Power Ranger are you? She's not also really given the space to be both. It's part of the reason that Say Her Name exists as a hashtag. Black women's issues are often subsumed into like their Blackness or their status as women and aren't really given the space to shine the way that they can and should, right? Even with the whole principle of it is decrying police brutality and extrajudicial killings of Black women. The men tend to gravitate towards the center of our attention, right? And even with that, though, there are more and more instances where Black women are able to be the front and center of what's going on, right? And there's eventually going to be a situation where we have like an official name for like the Bechdel test, where it's two named Black women who are having a relevant conversation about not a man. So you think about it, Black Panther had Shuri and Okoye and Ramonda and Riri Williams. All of them had conversations that weren't male-centered, right? And we can absolutely have more of this as time progresses, right? My niece has had an official Disney princess who's looked like her since before she was even conceived, okay? Going to the Bibbidi Bobbidi boutique and having a princess who looks like her and being able to dress like that is something that I was not going to be able to do as a kid. If I had gone, I would have ended up dressing up as Ariel, not as Tiana, because even though I would have liked to be a Tiana, I didn't have these options, right? So, like, imagine the kind of stories that we're going to be able to see in a post-Sinners world, right? Like, I'm so excited. All right, so let's take a second to temper our excitement, though. At record time, the Oscars themselves haven't come out, and I don't actually know for a fact how much respect the Academy and them is gonna put on Ryan Coogler's in them's names. Also, side note, Zinzi Evans, Ryan Coogler's wife, is a huge part of the process, and I wish I could figure out how it is that we would be able to get her a lot of awards as well. But anyway, the important part is that we want to take the opportunity to focus on the fact that we need to be able to tell our stories, right? And I think that the more time that we spend telling our stories and the more opportunities that we get to tell our stories, the bigger the box office is going to be, right? And also, realistically speaking, having stories of people who look like us are going to be amazing, okay? It is so cool for to be able to have a Disney princess who looks like me. And I don't know how it is to live in a world where I didn't have where that was just a given. That's very cool. So while I do not know how many award the cast of Sinners is going to snatch, it should be all of them, but apparently I'm not allowed to make that decision yet because I'm not in the Academy. What I will say is that we can, look on our calendar and make sure that we have our Marvel and DC events checked out for the week, though. Yeah. So Hawkman and Hawkgirl, aka Qatar and Shayra's, their wedding anniversary is actually on Valentine's Day. Happy Valentine's Day, guys. Continuing on, what's going on in February, we have Elbar Brain, the Reverse Flash. So his birthday apparently is February 18th. So, very interesting Aquarius. I will say that there are also Earth One superheroes in the DC verse who have a February birthday. So in Earth One, apparently, Bruce Wayne's birthday is 2/19, and Earth One, Hal Jordan, his birthday apparently is 2/20. So happy birthday to all of these folks. I think that you guys all fall in the Aquarius cusp. Maybe the day after is when we run into Pisces. But for right now, I'm pretty sure that let's see where the sun was whenever you guys actually debuted. Anyway, that's not important. What is important is the fact that listeners, we have in fact come to the end of our podcast. I know. How is it over so soon? Good news. Our next episode will be coming out next week. You're also more than welcome to listen to this episode again if that's not fast enough, or feel free to join our Patreon, right? www.patreon.com/upyournerdcredpod, where you can get all kinds of things like the solo scripts. You can get behind the scenes footage. Nerd cred takes time to build. But if you can be irritated at characters in children's cartoons, it's probably both a parental milestone and one that you can hit in your anti-racism journey. How about that? Yeah. Anyway, now is the time to mention that we have an Instagram, we're on Apple, we're on Spotify, we're on YouTube, and, of course, we're always working on expanding our reach. If you like the episode, of course, make sure to rate, review, subscribe, all of the things that they always say, especially if you're trying to up your nerd cred. You can follow us on Instagram at Up Your Nerd Cred Pod, also on TikTok, actually, at Up Your Nerd Cred Pod. If you're looking for me across platforms, I'm at CiCi Davis. My co-host is at AMDaz Art, and he loves the opportunity to be a pedant. So if you want to know something, hit him up. Actually, if you have a burning question that you want us to discuss so that you can up your nerd cred, make sure, again, like I said, like, subscribe, and leave comments. And if we pick your question, we'll actually shout you out during the discussion segment. And as I said before, we have launched a Patreon. And so while you should definitely follow the link in the show notes to join it, you should also get your friends to like and subscribe too. And your family members, and your coworkers that you trust not to be weird about listening to the same podcast as you, and maybe any sanitation workers that might be digging you out of the snow. All right, good night, everybody.